The time between Rift Apart and Into the Nexus was probably the longest drought the franchise has ever gone through. A lot of us assumed that Into the Nexus was the end of it all, and whatever Clank did with the Dimensionator was left for us to fill in. But then, around June 2020, Rift Apart was announced, and, well, the initial concept of this game sounded interesting. Going by the name Ratchet and Clank Eternals, it was going to involve Ratchet and Clank using a device known as the Universal Remote to go to another dimension. Honestly, I don't know all the details behind this, but Ratchet and his dimensional counterpart Rivet would have swapped dimensions, with the two of them working to find a way back to their respective homes. Along the way, they'd learn to overcome certain personal issues that held them back, such as Rivet's anger towards robots. Now, I mention this because I feel like they cut out too many things from this early draft, and what we got, for the story at least, didn't feel as satisfying. Rift Apart is a solid Ratchet and Clank game, but certain unrefined aspects prevent it from going beyond that. Or, at least it wasn't a perfect culmination of the 8-year drought between this and its predecessor. Let's start with the story. So, I really have to give some props to Insomniac for trying to open in a different way. Whereas the previous games often had Ratchet and Clank hanging out, this one tries to set up a more dystopian atmosphere. The entire city is being run by a dictator, as seen with all the nefarious troopers surveilling the area. All of a sudden, we're greeted with this masked pink Lombax. While it appears her initial goal was to snag an infobot, she later pursues and manages to save a fellow civilian that was fleeing from the troopers. The fact that we don't know the identity of this Lombax and what she's fighting for adds quite a bit of mystique and intrigue. Unfortunately, this darker atmosphere doesn't last, for we're transported to a dimension we're more familiar with. On planet Megalopolis, a celebration takes place honoring the heroic deeds of Ratchet and Clank. I like how Insomniac uses Ratchet's anxiety to acknowledge the 8-year drought the series has gone through, as he frets about being out of shape and not having done hero stuff in a while.
Don't you think it's weird to throw a celebration for us? I mean, we haven't done anything heroic in years. What if everyone thinks we're washed up? Oh, what if we are washed up?
It kind of shows how self-aware Insomniac is. So, just as Ratchet needs a refresher on getting back into the groove of things, we the player get a refresher on Ratchet and Clank's origin and such in this beauty of a tutorial. Seriously, they really use this opening level to show off the horsepower of the PS5. Also, I'm recording the footage directly from the console with my Elgato, so no more using that ugly-ass AV adapter. Therefore, I'm able to enjoy the full magnitude and color of this game without having to water the graphics down just to bypass the HDCP. Anyway, Clank has a special surprise for his friend, and it turns out that he repaired the entire Dimensionator so that he could go back in time to meet the other Lombaxes. Now, my initial thought to seeing this was, okay, Clank, what a weird way to change your mind out of the blue like that. Weren't you the one who recommended destroying the Dimensionator and Tools of Destruction because you thought it was too dangerous? In fact, he even repeats this in A Crack in Time. But maybe with Tachyon gone, he doesn't feel as cautious, and even in Into the Nexus, he did express a desire to fix it. So, maybe it's not too bad of a retcon. What is a retcon, though, is that it's not a hat anymore. For whatever reason, Clank made it into a gun. But before they could do anything with it, Dr. Nefarious crashes at a party and steals the device. He plans to use it to go to a dimension where he always wins, so that Ratchet and Clank would finally know how it feels. I guess his old goal of turning everybody into robots isn't a thing anymore. Well, while he was trying to activate it, Ratchet shoots it, which damages the device and makes the dimensions unstable. This causes different rifts to appear. Nefarious transports Ratchet, Clank, and himself to a brand new dimension, but because of its broken state, the Dimensionator ends up imploding after its use, separating the two of them. Clank ends up losing his arm and meeting the mysterious pink Lombax, who we're introduced to as Rivet. Ratchet ends up meeting members of the Resistance on the other side of town, and eventually a golden former Nefarious bot named KT-7461, otherwise known as Kit, who is like the dimensional counterpart of Clank, and Nefarious ends up in the castle of his counterpart, crowning himself Emperor right then and there. Yeah, he really just does that. And the entire story initially revolves around Ratchet, Clank, Kit, and Rivet trying to rebuild the Dimensionator in order to bring them back to their original homes. But then they meet Emperor Nefarious, and the plot thickens into another universe-saving event. not too uncommon for the stories within this series. But despite the darker tone it was trying to go for, it actually goes back to being relatively safe and simple and nothing too groundbreaking. This game was written by a different writer named Sam Maggs instead of TJ Fixman, and you can tell because there are certain plot elements and character arcs that aren't consistent with what was set up in the previous future installments. I'll give credit where it's due that the old cast seems faithful to their original characterization. Ratchet is very brash and headstrong in his approach to problems. However, at the same time, he manages to be compassionate and caring, as seen with how understanding he was with Kit, in the way he wasn't so quick to judge her when they first meet. Clank continues to be his intellectual and logical sidekick that is very good at coming up with solutions of tough issues, as seen with how he managed to help the Fixer out of his mentally unstable state. They're likable on a surface level. However, looking at it more in depth is where the cracks start to show. A crack in time and into the Nexus state that Ratchet chose not to go back to his family because he realized there was too great a risk in doing it, and he figured it wasn't the most productive use of his time, as he realized that dwelling on the past simply wasn't as fulfilling as focusing on the present. Well, Rift Apart throws all that out the window, and now Ratchet doesn't want to meet the other Lombaxes because he's worried what they might think of him and how he might turn out to be a disappointment to them.
What if they're not what I expected? What if I'm not what they expected?
Perhaps somebody could say that worry was always in the back of his head, he just never articulated it, but obviously this wasn't what was set up in previous games. A better way to write Ratchet's character is to have him question his satisfaction. As much as he'd like to say he's internally at peace with his decision not to pursue the other Lombaxes, there's a part of him that's just gnawing at him from the inside, wondering if it was really the correct move. This could have been demonstrated by showing how even with Tallman and Clank, he feels lonely being the last of his kind in his dimension. I wish they had added Tallman's character back to add more weight to this. There could have been a scene where she comforts Ratchet and tells him that she's going to be okay no matter what he chooses, and just wants him to be happy in the end. This whole inadequacy character arc Rift Apart tries to introduce just feels so out of the blue, and I don't know if it was just Sam Maggs inserting a part of herself onto Ratchet. After all, we writers do tend to have a lot of self-confidence issues. But it doesn't fit because it was never mentioned before in the past. But at least with Ratchet, the writers try to address his long-running conflict. With Clank, it almost felt like the story wasn't sure what to do with him. Clank ends up losing his arm after he crash lands on Rivet's dimension. I guess this is supposed to parallel with the fact that Rivet also has a lost arm, but they don't really do anything substantial with this. Maybe if Clank had trauma about losing his arm, it could work considering that he and Rivet could connect over that, considering Rivet also suffers from PTSD over this as well. However, what they do instead is kind of awkward writing. When they reach Torren 4, Rivet and Clank need to look for the Fixer in order to repair the Phase Quartz, the special crystal that powers the Dimensionator. However, the Fixer is damaged because he's distressed by the fact everything around him is broken, and the way he comes to his senses is when Clank states that despite the fact he has a lost limb, he doesn't really need it because deep down he's always going to be Clank no matter how damaged he is. Okay? This scene could have easily worked if Clank was shown to be struggling doing basic things with his missing arm. It could have made him a relatable character, especially to those who have actually lost one of their body parts. But we never actually see any of that throughout the story, so this scene feels kind of forced. If you want me to be honest, I think it should have been Kit talking to the Fixer and not Clank. Kit herself feels broken over the fact that she can't forgive herself for all the crimes she did when she was under Nefarious.
Why do none of you understand? I am broken. I will always be broken.
But perhaps helping the Fixer overcome his distress would in turn heal her from any guilt she'd experienced of her past. If they wanted to concentrate on a theme about brokenness with Clank, a better route probably would have been to focus on how he felt like he wasn't good enough for his father Orpheus because he rejected his destiny to be caretaker of the Great Clock. Maybe that might make him look a bit wishy-washy. After all, he was the one who made that choice to be there for Ratchet, but the conflict would fit in the context of the narrative. Like, Clank's identity of being the keeper of space and time was a very significant development in the story, and it just never comes up ever again. Well, maybe his ability to fix dimensional anomalies is a reference to his powers, but still, I don't think it should have been brushed under the rug like that. However, I think Dr. Nefarious gets the worst treatment of the bunch. As Up Your Arsenal tried to show, Dr. Nefarious is so much more than just being a fucking loudmouthed evil villain who elicits a couple of chuckles. His entire plan revolved around him wanting to turn everybody into robots because he hated organic life forms so much, and there was an entire backstory dedicated to how he was bullied in bio class. Rift Apart seems to go back to what A Crack in Time started, which was his obsession with winning. Why did they forget this detail about him? It gave him a proper motivation as to why he did what he did. Also, there's not a single time Dr. Nefarious gets short-circuited with a Lance and Janice episode playing in the background. You know, whenever he screams,
That's what makes it so good, Janice. Feel it. My heart is pounding like an anvil.
Oh, this is the best part of my day.
Yeah, this just never happens in Mags' interpretation of Nefarious. Instead, we see his bumbling ass get overshadowed by his dimensional counterpart, Emperor Nefarious. And he's just a generic dictator. Seriously, taking away his evil laugh and cackling voice reduces his personality by a lot. I mean, I guess Emperor Nefarious is more competent than his counterpart, but that doesn't really mean anything considering how bland he is. You know an emperor that they should have brought back? Tachyon. It frustrates me that we never got a proper resolution for him. After all, he says,
Only I know your true purpose in this galaxy. Only I know your true name.
So, what is Ratchet's true name? What is his true destiny? Since we're dealing with more Dimensionator shenanigans, it would have made more sense to have him return. Having Nefarious appear for the 4th time just makes me feel like they're milking him and just playing it safe. Speaking of which, since we're on the topic of dimensional counterparts, let's talk about Rivet and Kit. Honestly, I think they're both very strong female characters without overshadowing the main protagonist. Rivet is very earnest and isn't afraid to jump into situations when the time calls for it. She manages to make me believe she really is a dimensional counterpart to Ratchet while still being her own character. In the original draft of Rift Apart, Rivet has a vendetta against robots and has little to no experience with organic life. So when she switches over to Ratchet's dimension, she learns to resolve that problem. In the game we got, she stays in her own dimension, and while her resentment for robots is still there, it doesn't feel emphasized all that much. When she first meets Clank, she initially feels kind of suspicious before quickly making friends with him, and with Kit, she's just very awkward with her. I mean, she later is shocked as soon as she learns Kit is the one who blew off her arm, but goes to rescue her from Zordon prison anyway.
Forgive her? Perhaps you should.
I don't know. But that won't stop me from saving her.
Like, they don't quite convince me that her struggle is as resonating to her as she makes it seem. Why don't they introduce how Rivet lost her arm at the point where she first meets Clank? Why don't they show us how she resents robots by having her get angry at them whenever she's talking to them, then slowly coming to realize they're not as bad as she thought? I guess there's one scene in the end where she gets angry at Kit and argues with Ratchet. I would have appreciated more scenes like this throughout the game, but instead, we get a rather go-lucky, happy Rivet for the majority of the playthrough. But besides that, I also feel like there's some missed potential with her character. As far as I can tell, she's simply just Ratchet from a different dimension. But, I don't know, she could have been like Azimuth and Bea Lombax from the Crackbite War. She could have been what Kara Zor-El was to Kal-El from the Superman franchise. That would have allowed the last Lombax story arc to move forward. Maybe if she'd been Ratchet's cousin, she could have known stuff about Ratchet's real name and all the shit Tachyon was blabbering about. But no, Insomniac instead decides to make this Lombax simply an alternate version of Ratchet, which is lame and cliché for obvious reasons. Kit's struggle is a bit better defined, but it also has some problems. Her main issue is basically she's trying to find a sense of belonging after walking away from being one of the Emperor's warbots. Deep down, she carries a lot of guilt for working for him. Therefore, she's too afraid to work with anyone in fear that she might harm them. Then she meets Ratchet, who gives her a bit of a confidence boost and helps her understand that she doesn't have to be the same person she was in the past. Overall, it's quite a solid arc, but it doesn't really get a proper resolution. After Rivet explains how she lost her arm, Kit, of course, is able to piece together that it was her that was responsible for such action, and later she gives this away when she turns into Giant Kit to attempt to stop Emperor Nefarious, which of course makes Rivet wary of her. This tension is manifested when the two of them argue with one another as Kit feels she can't confidently rejoin the team because of her past, and Rivet is rightfully upset at her, considering she can't overlook the way that Kit injured her. The problem arises in the fact that there's no scene to resolve this. Kit just randomly shows up in the final battle to help, and they just make amends just like that. Couldn't there at least have been a scene where Gary reassures Kit to get back out there, or Rivet goes back looking for her to tell her she forgives her? Instead, Kit goes through her healing process off-screen, which makes it far less impactful. And then, of course, you have all the counterparts to the other characters. Pierre Lafouille is the dimensional counterpart to Rusty Pete, Captain Quantum is a counterpart to Captain Quark, and the Zircons you see in the Battleplex Arena and the Vendors are supposed to be a more peaceful version of themselves, opposite to what they were like in Ratchet's dimension. I guess Pierre is a bit more of a good guy, which contrasts quite a bit with Pete considering he was often depicted as more of a villain. Quantum is just as much of a coward as his original self in Quark. There really isn't too much to talk about them, if I were to be honest, as they were mostly one-note caricatures throughout the story. In fact, the only one of these dimensional counterparts I liked is the Phantom, who's like a more serious version of Skidbick Marks. Compared to the more relaxed, laid-back guy that he was in previous entries, his dimensional counterpart has taken a darker turn, becoming a more brooding and outspoken fighter. Unlike the bumbling twat that got himself captured and turned into a robot in Up Your Arsenal, the Phantom is far more skilled. He probably does the most against the Emperor, as seen with the part in Nefarious City where we have to protect him while he gives a speech countering his propaganda. His change in personality is reflected in his design, as his helmet is now clamped shut over his eyes, concealing his true face and adding a bit of mystery behind him. It's said that he suffers from the same exact problem as the other dimensional counterparts, in the sense that he never gets too many appearances throughout the game, so we never get to see him be developed in a meaningful way. And speaking of not having too many appearances, where the fuck is Lawrence? Dr. Nefarious just never felt complete without his iconic butler. He always felt like the calmer, more relaxed person that balanced out the hysterical, evil doctor. So where is he? I guess the end credits show that he's on paternal leave, but still, I don't know, Dr. Nefarious just doesn't feel like Dr. Nefarious. I suppose this female robot servant is kind of like the dimensional counterpart to him, but it's just not the same. She doesn't really have the same presence or personality that he did. She's just another generic, evil android that is just blindly following the orders of the Emperor, just in a less funny and entertaining way. But if you're sick of me bitching and whining about the story, don't worry. That part's mostly out of the way. There were a lot of things I liked about this game, especially with the presentation. Insomniac knew that the PS5 is a really powerful console, and this can be seen with how much bigger they've made each of the planets. They no longer feel like linear pathways you had to follow, and have opened up quite a bit. Zavali was probably the most notable planet to catch my attention, with the temple crawling across the terrain and the many different types of enemies and life forms to be found there. It makes the planet feel very inhabited, which encourages you to explore it more. Or take Nefarious City. There's a bar with many people dancing to music, with disco colors illuminating the whole place. It feels like this is a society where people actually live, and not just some barren, abandoned ghost town. And speaking of ghost towns, Torren 4 has been much improved from a crack in time. Now it almost feels like the Mos Eisley spaceport from Star Wars. The junkyard bots hold yard sales and call out to potential buyers in hopes of selling their product, which is very unlike how they were just standing around in a crack in time. And to expand on the immensity of these planets, Rift Apart allows the player to travel to different versions of them. By hitting a Blizon crystal, Ratchet and Rivet can go back and forth between two different dimensions, which creates some contrasting environments for the stage. For instance, on Blizon Prime, the initial dimension you start in presents the cold ruins of a space station that has been destroyed several years ago. There's a woman that keeps trying to contact you, and considering the distressed tone of her cries, it provides us with a certain degree of context of the catastrophic events that took place. However, hitting a Blizon crystal will transport you over to a livelier facility that houses miners trying to pay the bill. Not those miners, you sick fucks! In the same way, Kadaro Station starts out as a dark abandoned base of operations for Emperor Nefarious, almost like something that's ripped straight out of a Resident Evil game. The only semblance of life here is a single robot named Junkbot and his pet monster Juice. In fact, they introduce some very interesting horror gameplay elements with the latter. You can't damage her with your weapons, so you have no choice but to try and evade her while distracting her with the Slurpee and jelly canisters. Since the visibility is low, it's very easy for Juice to just sneak up on you, and this often had me on the edge of my seat as I played through it. A very solid break from the 3D shooting and platforming typical of these games. Anyway, the alternate dimension for this level shows a Kadaro station starting to feel alive. There are now multiple bots working within the factory, and it is much more fully functioning, which provides it with the necessary tools to forge a new Dimensionator. In a way, this builds up on what A Crack in Time did with the time portals, in which Ratchet and Clank had to go back and forth between the past and present in order to alter certain events. Whereas the time traveling happened a bit too rarely for my liking, the dimension hopping gimmick in Rift Apart feels much more embedded within the core gameplay. What makes these environments all the more interesting are the numerous NPCs. You've got the Morts, who are these hamsters inhabiting planet Sargasso. Cordelion has Junkbot, who constantly wants to refer to Ratchet and Kit as different nicknames. On Blizzard Prime, there's Chef Tulio, who's ever so determined to gather her ingredients despite nature's opposition, and the Savali monks, whose personalities range from being flamboyant to hip and cool while still having the common characteristic of serenity. Honestly, I'm just glad Insomniac branched out from using the smuggler all the time. But what about the core gameplay? For the most part, it's the same as it was in previous entries. However, there's smaller mechanics they introduced to add some more depth to the combat. Ratchet and Rivet are now both equipped with rift tethers that allow them to jump between different points within a certain area. This is very useful in the midst of combat, whenever there are a lot of enemies firing on you and you need to get out of a tight situation quickly. Although, the hitbox lasts through the animation, so you might take damage while traveling through it. You also now have the ability to phantom dash while strafing, which is basically like a very fast dodge. Now, initially I dismissed this ability as another one of those moves where I'd never use again. I mean, I could easily dodge enemies' attacks by jumping while strafing. Why the fuck would I need a dodge move? Well, a lot of the time I found that enemies would close in on me more often than before, and considering the way the armor system works in this game, it's much easier to take damage. Therefore, I had to implement this dodge to handle quite a few large mob fights. This was especially the case with the final boss, where there were so many ways for Emperor Nefarious to score a cheap shot on me, such as when he uses lasers to fire homing beams at me, or when he charges to unleash a Superman punch. Seriously, how the fuck are you supposed to dodge that? Ratchet and Rivet now also have the ability to run along walls as well, which doesn't really add much other than a really cool visual spectacle with the platforming. But there are some bigger innovations that go along with these smaller changes. The armor system, for instance, has been revamped. Now they're all introduced as different pieces you obtain instead of getting the full set. It's similar to what Size Matters did, except in that game it was slightly better executed because they gave Ratchet different wrench abilities. Yeah, you heard me right. A high-impact game spin-off did something better than a mainline Insomniac installment. For in Rift Apart, having a full set doesn't really do anything. Instead, the pieces themselves have their own effects, like the helmet you get on Ardolus reduces the damage you receive from pirates by 5%, or the leggings of One Piece increases the amount of experience you get. I'm not really sure why they did it like this, because it really inconveniences the whole armor system. At least the pocket dimensions you get the different pieces from provide decent platforming challenges. These are hidden throughout each of the planets and force you to use the platforming gimmicks in a different way. In Kadaro Station, there are these hot air balloons that you bounce on. Well, not only do you have to bounce on a whole lot of them in the pocket dimension, but you also have to figure out how to activate them in a timely manner, as failing to do so will cause you to fall into the bottomless void, something that the original level didn't have you do. Or the TNT crates that were just a minor inconvenience become a credible threat when they're the only viable pathway to reach the end. In fact, I might go so far as to say that they went the extra mile with a lot of the collectibles, as they now serve as a means of accessing different in-universe lore. There are these infobots scattered around that all contain vital information to build the Rhino 8, but instead of just having a blueprint, now they also have background details that talk about the planet itself and how Emperor Nefarious's rule has changed it. Again, it helps create the atmosphere and mood of the more dystopian tone this game was going for. There are also a lot of Lombax slorbs that can be found on planet Savali, and these are journal entries that an acquaintance of Caden named Mags, I see what you did there, documented while he was exploring the different dimensions. I do think it's cute how these journal entries reference both Sly Cooper and Jak and Daxter.
Dimension 31X7, not super different from home, but there were these creatures. One was firing a gun and spinning himself around every other second, while the other hung out on his shoulder doing live commentary. Oh, I wanted to hang out with them so badly. Pretty standard stuff, except the colors there were so vivid, like, whoa. And there were these creatures. One of them even looked like a Lombax, but he had smaller ears, a mask, and a cane, and I think he was pulling some kind of heist.
However, I feel as if these journal entries could have been used to go into more detail concerning more important matters like Ratchet's childhood, or what Caden was like, and how the Lombax society operated. The last two Lorbs are the only ones that talk about any significant lore regarding the Great War, but most of that was retreading ground we already knew. On the other hand, some of the collectibles don't really have much to do with the plot and are kind of just there. On Sargasso, there are these little berries known as Zerp stones that are scattered all over the map, and a lot of them need to be reached via the transportation of Trudy. She functions very similarly to the Robo-Wings from Tools of Destruction, but she has a lot more maneuvers like being able to accelerate, shoot fireballs, and to dive towards certain points. Rivet can also pilot these Speedles. The courses you go through while riding these are pretty fast-paced, and since there are a lot of obstacles that pop up to block your way, you really need to be quick on your feet when it comes to maneuvering around these while moving non-stop. The hacking minigames come back in the form of the Spider Glitch, whose main role is to clear away viruses from computers and switches in order to allow Ratchet to progress. These clearly feel like they're taken straight out of the Spider-Man PS4 game, as there were certain missions that had you control a little spider bot to take pictures and such. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, and for the most part these were pretty fun in their simplicity. They also bear a bit of a resemblance to the Sparks minigames from Spyro Year of the Dragon, in which you had to press buttons to open up different areas, and how enemies usually never stopped coming until you destroyed their source. I really liked how there was a story behind these sections, as minor as it was, as each terminal glitch clears leads her closer to confronting the Master Virus. Overall, this is probably the best implementation of the hacking minigames in the series. I have similar praise for the Clank sections. There are some parts in the game where he or Kit have to fix a dimensional rupture or anomaly, and they basically go inside and guide their multiple selves, which are known as their possibilities, to the end of the stage through the means of using different energy spheres that affect the environment in a multitude of ways. I really like the unique concept, and I feel like it's a natural successor to what was in A Crack in Time and Into the Nexus. They also feel a lot less linear compared to those because they force you to explore the area for other spheres. Sometimes the correct answer isn't always obvious. Initially, they start out as very simple, but become more complex as you do more of them, with a lot of different elements being added to make the puzzles more complicated, like spinergizers that need to be energized with an electric sphere, or switches that need to be pressed at a certain moment to bring down platforms to get your possibilities across. They don't become too hard to the point that they produce controller-tossing moments, but they're also not too easy to the point that they make me feel numb. I wish the rest of the game's difficulty was like that. I started out on Rebel Agent and didn't die at all except for a few areas in the arena. I raised it to Resistance later, and definitely felt more challenged, but still rarely died. Well, except for maybe some parts where I wasn't sure what to do, like that one part in Ordolus where you had to swing shot onto a certain ship to get to a higher elevation. It was generally a bit too easy. I guess I should have mentioned this game brings back the hover boots and really improves upon them. I was very disappointed with how they functioned in Into the Nexus. You couldn't really accelerate with them, and their controls were very janky. Here, they've become a lot more refined. You can pick up speed very easily. I really like how Ratchet and Rivet sort of skate underground when they accelerate. It gives that impact needed to make me feel like I'm actually going faster. And with that, we can actually move on to my favorite part of Rift Apart, and that's the weapons. Now, I'm not going to do what I did before and rank all of them. I'll just go over all the changes and the new features that I really enjoyed. First of all, thank fucking Christ there's no combustor! Yeah, this weapon sucked as a starting gun. What you get instead, the burst pistol, has a faster rate of fire and feels a lot more fun to use. Some new weapons include Mr. Fungi, who behaves like this game's version of Mr. Zircon. Honestly, I felt like this was a worse version of the Synthanoid, because most of the time I could barely hear the insults they were saying. The topiary sprinkler is like this game's version of the mini turret gun, but it doesn't really do any damage and freezes enemies in place. That might sound like it sucks, but considering how often mobs overwhelm you in this game, it's actually quite useful to have them stand still to take them out with a clean shot. The Drill Hound is probably one of the best new weapons this game introduces, mainly for its good area effect and the different ways you can use it. You can fire it into the ground and take enemies by surprise when it bursts out of the earth, or you can shoot it directly onto foes like a regular projectile weapon. Either way, it does a lot of damage to foes upon hitting them. The Lightning Rod is sort of like an improved Tesla Claw from the first Ratchet and Clank. You can actually chain the electricity when the enemies are within close proximity. The Ricochet unleashes a ball that can hit your foes multiple times after the first shot, which helps preserve ammo. The Agents of Doom feel like they're vastly improved from their predecessors because they actually go out of their way to attack their enemies instead of just kamikazeing straight away. It's too bad that their design is kind of uninspired because they're just gadget bots Clank used to control. But what's probably the best new weapon is the introduction of the machine gun in the form of the Black Hole Storm. Initially, I thought this was just going to be another Rift Inducer 5000, so for the longest time I was just holding off on buying it. But boy, I was dead wrong. The game goes out of its way to balance this weapon out. Despite all the satisfying damage the Black Hole Storm is able to do, it has a tendency to overheat, so you need to wait a couple seconds after using it for an extended period of time. Whenever you are firing it, man, is it so sweet and cathartic just ripping into these nefarious troopers' metallic flesh by rapid fire. Yeah, die, motherfuckers! I know there are other weapons that I missed, but I didn't feel like they were worth talking about. The Cold Snap does the same thing as all the other freezing weapons. It freezes them into cubes. The I'm not saying that word Tron Collider fires a beam of energy and that's it. I will say that I really liked the sound effects because it always was literally ripped straight from the Transformers animated series. Insomniac probably knew this as both this weapon and Zeta Series' main antagonist have the suffix Tron. The Bombardier is close to useless with its low ammunition and the fact that it targets one enemy at a time, and the Headhunter is just a plasma striker, but much better since it slows down time enough for you to get a clear shot. All of these weapons can be upgraded via Raritanium, and this pretty much works the same as it did before. Seriously, there's no need to explain it all again. But if there was one thing that I wish the gameplay did better, it was to make Ratchet and Rivet feel more distinct from one another. They both have the same armor, the same weapons, the same gadgets, pretty much the same everything, and the places where they are different it feels a bit too restrictive. I feel like Ratchet should be able to travel to Blizar Prime at his own will, in the same way that Rivet should be able to collect Lombax Lorbs on Savali. Don't get me wrong, I don't think either character really overshadowed the other, and contrary to what most people think, I believe it makes sense for Rivet to finish off Emperor Nefarious, because that's the main baddie in her dimension. I just feel like Insomniac didn't use these characters to the fullest, and mostly played it safe with how they're utilized. And that's kind of how I feel about the game as a whole. It really pains me to say this, while Rift Apart is a very solid entry, it's nothing groundbreaking. The game stays true to all the elements that make up a good Ratchet and Clank game. I may even say that to a certain extent it pushes it further with the introduction of bigger planets to traverse in. But I don't know, I expected something that would have finally brought closure to the last Lombax arc. And sure, Ratchet's plight gets mentioned here and there, but it never feels like it's fully resolved. I suppose the ending sort of indicates that Rivet and Ratchet are going to use the Dimensionator to find the other Lombaxes, but whatever happened to the times where he straight up said he was satisfied with where he was? I guess Clank does say at the end of A Crack in Time that Ratchet was going to need him until he found his family, but that seems more hypothetically speaking if he ever found them at all. And Into the Nexus made it seem like he was no longer interested. But I think the worst part about all of this is that the game just feels like another dimension-hopping adventure instead of something that truly moves the story forward. It's a bit too simplistic in its scope in that regard. Rift Apart is a game that checks all the boxes, but I was expecting a bit more, especially after hiatus that lasted so long. I wouldn't say it's as bad as something like The Phantom Menace, where we waited and waited for the prequels and we got something kind of bad, but I will say that it's more in line with The Force Awakens, where after a lengthy drought, we just got something that was okay but underwhelming. And yeah, that's pretty much all the Ratchet and Clank games reviewed. Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. And all I can say is, this is a series that has done the same thing for the longest time but also hasn't, in subtle ways. While the shooting and platforming has mostly been the same, the tone of the series has shifted in more ways than one. The satirical potshots at capitalism and the adult humor the original games had have been traded in for something that's louder, more epic, and, dare I say it, the very thing it was satirizing in the first place. In a way, it feels like the series lost something as time went on, and I have a sense that it's probably not going to get it back anytime soon. Sure, change is a part of life, but arguably Insomniac hasn't quite handled it all that well. When they chose to forgo the option to conclude the last Lombax story arc, they just added a bunch of fluff that just didn't go anywhere. Well, Rift Apart doesn't look like the end of the series, so here's hoping the next game can finally tie up the loose ends. I didn't mean to end on such a depressing note. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for having this opinion. Well, hopefully all the sweat and tears it took to make this video was worth it. Anyway, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This is Dave Reviews, signing out.